everyone. Welcome to today's edition of Curation Corner, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. I'm Randy.
I'm Rachel.
And I'm Chad.
So each week we engage in brief conversations around a resource, summarizing the author's ideas, making connections to our own experiences, and sharing insights that further learning here at the Human School. In today's episode, we're chatting about the article 5 Questions About Motivation with Daniel Pink by Sarah Goff-DuPont. You can find a link in the video description below as well as on the Human School. So this article is an interview with author Daniel Pink on the 10th anniversary of his best-selling book, Drive. In the book, Pink puts forth the elements for intrinsic motivation. And those elements are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And if you followed our stuff here at the Human School, you might have heard that on one of our podcast episodes. Pink's research shows that focusing on these elements of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, they provide better performance over external things like bonuses and punishment. So why is designing cultures around the intrinsic motivators of autonomy, mastery, and purpose not the norm? Here's what Pink tells us. Extrinsic motivators are good, but just for short-term algorithmic tasks. But when it comes to things like creativity, critical thinking, and discernment, they're not so good. Internal motivators like autonomy are king in this conversation. And I love this quote from the article. Not being self-directed is learned behavior. Certain social structures and certain social expectations can cause that muscle to atrophy. School, anyone? And the key to helping people build their self-direction autonomy muscle? Be curious. Ask questions instead of telling people what they should do. So this may seem like an old conversation. Like I said, we've had this before on the podcast. But when we're designing for school transformation, let's work to build community so that those elements are present: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. People will feel like they can do their best work, and there'll be less friction on the path to progress. And you know what? It's only human. It's just human. As humans, we know that we work better when we have a sense of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And leaders can start by designing around these conditions.
So one of the things that I picked up on, when I read this is that many of the dehumanizing qualities of school are really around the carrots and sticks that Dan Pink talks about. So when you think about discipline practices and grading, they oftentimes are completely disregarding the person who's behind the desk, so to speak. So that's probably also true, of us as adults in the system, but definitely how we treat kids. And so part of our work here is identifying those problems of practice within a traditional system. And almost always there's an element of learners being robbed of their autonomy or of their agency. Our learners aren't really given the time and space to achieve that mastery. And we are so quick and unwilling to acknowledge that each person has their own individualized purpose. And so I think that when I consider many of the elements that are frictions or barriers in a traditional system to being a more human version, they're oftentimes tied to these carrots and sticks that Dan Pink talks about.
I think too, what's interesting is that as he's talking about that extrinsic motivation and the ability versus intrinsic, and the ability for companies to create spaces that have autonomy, mastery, and purpose for their employees, I can't help but think the same thing for our students, that so often, and we've talked about this before, that our teachers are really frustrated because that's what they want in their classrooms. They want to have those things for themselves as part of professional development and as part of the building work. But then students are the same way, that that list of elements isn't different for them, but how often we struggle as teachers to actually still offer those things for students, and yet find ourselves frustrated when they don't seem intrinsically motivated and they're not motivated by the carrots and sticks that you're talking about. And yet we're not motivated by those same things either. We know that for ourselves. they're just smaller people. They're just younger people. And so that reality of motivation is the same for them. And so often we forget that.
I think we can tie in actually one of our other mind shifts into this conversation, listening to both of you make your points. And I think it's that futures focused mind shift. And we just recently had a conversation about one of the things that's happening in the future is more complexity and more chaos. And if we think about when schools were designed, 150 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of complexity. It was about everyone doing standardized things. And so, the punishments and the simplistic motivators, those worked. But now we're complex now, and we're going to get even more complex in the future. So all the more reason to focus on those three things that Pink mentions for us. So I'm tying this into that mind shift of ours.
I will say one of the things that I found really fascinating in thinking about a connection, I thought more broadly about the compass points and how autonomy, mastery, and purpose, much like the compass point, provides a tool or a framework, for lack of a better word, for motivation. And the interviewer actually comes right out in the post and acknowledges that schools engineer motivation out of kids, which I thought was pretty interesting. Like that it wasn't written about schools, but she clearly is like, look, I mean, schools clearly do this. Like, and so is it something that we inside the system aren't willing to acknowledge because it's an inconvenient truth, or a collective illusion, because we've been talking a lot about Todd Rose's work to make another connection there. But I thought that was pretty interesting that she just came right out and acknowledged that. Engineered out.
And that was actually one of the things that resonated for me, because I know when I was in schools, and this book came out 10 years ago, and I read it then, and I remember it emblazoned in my memory, like these things we need to keep in mind when we design systems in schools. And there would be oftentimes I'd say, like, we're sucking the passion out of kids. We're sucking the purpose out of teachers. We're sucking the motivation for these things. When I would observe a lesson, or I don't mean to sound totally negative, but there were definitely times when I'd be like, this is not designed for the right kind of motivation. So that was one of the things that resonated in the article, that she did point that out, because I had pointed that out to myself numerous times in my own practice.
I think one of the things too is I don't think that the systems are designed to do that, which is something that you started talking about, is that from the beginning, that's never what they were about. That's never what they were for. And I think that as our world changes, not just complexity, but what it is that we think is valuable. It used to be the industrial model: compliance, 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 meet a schedule, follow the bell. And as things shift, I think that most people, if you ask them what they want for students, can tell you that that's not what they're looking for, but that how we get from what we have now that is completely at odds with that to what I think most people would like to see, how we get there, I think is an area of real struggle for people. And I think Pink kind of talks about that a little bit when he talks about the remote work piece, this idea that school even has to be 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 180 days a year. Or if we're saying that what we value is autonomy, mastery, and purpose, does it have to happen in school? Does it have to happen in those 8 hours times 5 times, whatever? It doesn't have to happen that way, and letting go of that structure even to let it happen.
You hit the nail on the head, in Rachel, in the sense that the common factor in those three things is they all require, for each person to achieve whichever those elements comes first to them, doesn't fit neatly into any time structure. Autonomy is not efficient. Mastery is not efficient. Driven by purpose is not efficient. Those all require time, and they can be fast, they can be slow, but it's all dictated by the individual, and our systems are not currently designed or configured to acknowledge those three things. So even where I think people are working around the edges, where schools are working in, let's say, competency-based as a way of thinking about mastery-based learning, many of the less fringy and more traditional models that still require kids to do things in a certain time structure. And so it's a hybridized version or bastardized version of what I think Pink would say with mastery. So anyway, your point about time is well taken.
You're hearkening back to the age when schools were designed, or the system was designed. There was something that I posted yesterday on Facebook, in the Facebook group that I found on LinkedIn. It's a quote from John Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest and most influential people this country has ever seen. And he said this: "I don't want a nation of thinkers. I want a nation of workers." And are our systems still designed to fulfill that statement? Not sure.
I think that I have this not sneaking suspicion. I feel like a lot of us, unfortunately, have the best of beliefs around why the systems were created. But I think that lack of historical context in understanding that this is not what they were created to do. They were actually created to keep kids from thinking, and they were created to keep kids compliant, keep adults compliant, that we've forgotten that, and we've stopped telling ourselves that historical piece of information. So it feels mean when we suspect it, but if you just go back and you look at it, you're like, oh wait, no, that is exactly what it was for.
Mm-hmm. And I know we're trying to wrap up, but the other part of that cynicism that I would offer to that statement is, we learned during the pandemic that schools, by some very loud people in the community, they only really care about them because of their custodial nature, right? So yes, there was a time when schools were designed and engineered because we wanted to create workers. Now schools are a social structure in which kids are just simply have a place to be, where they're not on the street getting in trouble, and mom and dad can go to work. And so I would say that there's like a whole nother level to that. There is the historical context of school, and then there is the modern challenge, which is that schools are a place where kids can be, instead of having to be home with mom and dad, or getting in trouble in the street, or whatever we perceive would happen if schools didn't exist. And I want to be very clear that that is not my belief about why schools should exist. But I think the pandemic laid that pretty clearly for many people.
And that's a domino effect of a lot of other social structures that we have too. So check out that article. It's linked below this video. 5 questions about motivation. Interview with Dan Pink. We leave each episode, we leave you with a series of questions for you to think about and to ponder. Here are our questions. How can you engage your community in conversations around the meaning of autonomy, mastery, and purpose? Also, how can we redesign or transform our learning spaces to leverage autonomy, mastery, and purpose? And lastly, is the perception of autonomy or lack thereof impeding changes in classrooms, schools, or is it a misunderstanding of purpose? All right, we wanted to thank everyone for learning alongside us in this edition of the Human Schools Curation Corner. Join us in today's conversation on YouTube by leaving a comment, or you could also subscribe. By placing humanity at the center of all design, the Human School seeks to share an evolving story of learning and its impact on the world. Check out our full learning journey. I don't know, is this correct? This seems awfully long. How are we ending this? That is not right.
Just end it how we've been winging it, so.
Okay. You'll edit this?
I will edit it.
I'm sorry to make you do that.
It's okay.
Yeah, this is like, did I miscopy this or something? What the hell? Okay. By placing humanity at the center of all design, the Human School seeks to share an evolving story of learning and its impact on the world. We can't wait to hear how you are intentionally placing humanity at the center. Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.